Everybody dies, don't they? Some come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
This is a true story. It happened in 1777, just south of Carlisle. And you must remember that in 1777 it was only 2 years since the city had been taken by Bonnie Prince Charlie and his Highland rebels. At that time the city had given way very quickly and Charlie had been crowned King of Great Britain in Carlisle. But after his defeat, the castle was full of Highland prisoners and the city was heavily garrisoned with the soldiers of King George. So there had been much unrest in those days, and the rule of law was not what it had been. Inside the city walls it was safe if you were an upstanding member of the merchant class or aristocracy. But outside the city the story was quite different. The road that goes south from Carlisle is known as the Great High Road, and it goes south through Penrith, eventually down through Lancaster and ultimately to London. In 1777, the Great High Road was haunted by highwaymen. And it was very dangerous to go out on that road after dark, and it was said only the bravest or the most foolhardy would venture on the Great High Road once night had fallen. The most notorious highwayman in those days was a man called John Whitefield, and he hailed from Cotehill, a small village just off the Great High Road, and he made a fine living from robbing the people who went up and down on their daily trade. But he was a wily man and had not been caught, even though the authorities suspected very much who he was. Well, in September 1777, one night, a man called Isaac Dodd, who was only 33, but had done very well for himself. His father had had a little money, but now he had made good of the money and invested in shipping in Whitehaven and in the lead mines on Alston Moor. He had a linen manufactory on the River Eden at Armathwaite, where his house was. But this particular day, he'd been for a meeting with business associates in a grand house on Fisher Street. Now, you remember that Fisher Street is where the Earl of Lonsdale had his grand mansion and many other fine houses. So the people he was dealing with had done very well for themselves. And after the meeting, they fed him with meat and then pastries and good red claret wine. But as the evening drew on and the afternoon faded, they wanted him to stay. But he was keen to return home to Armathwaite, some 5 or 6 miles south of Carlisle along the Great High Road. He wanted to see his wife, Hannah, and his 2 children. His hosts bade him stay for the night. They had plenty of bedrooms, they said, and he could set off just as early as he wanted the next day and be home within an hour or so and see his wife and children then. But Isaac Dodd would hear nothing of it, for although he was a successful merchant, he was also a well-beloved family man, and he wanted to see Hannah and his children, hopefully to put them to bed for the night. So, despite their protestations, he left their grand house in Fisher Street and mounted his bay horse and set off just as the evening was coming on and the daylight was fading and a light drizzle set in. He went through Carlisle, through the South Gates, onto Botchergate, and then along what is the London Road, the Great High Road, until he left the city. The night had fallen now, and the clouded sky and the rain made it darker than it would have been otherwise. But he was full of wine, and he'd done a good business deal, so he was dozing a little, and his bay horse knew the way home. So she clip-clopped all the way along the Great High Road out of Carlisle, through Carlton, and then came to the Golden Fleece Inn, but he didn't stop there. He continued on the Great High Road until he came to the turn for Cotehill. He wasn't paying much attention to his surroundings. He was dozing, daydreaming, in reverie as he went along in the dark night. But as he passed the Cotehill turn, he thought he felt the sense of somebody behind him. So he slowed the horse and turned in his saddle and looked behind him. But the visibility was poor and he couldn't see anybody. So he continued on, and his horse clip-clopped along, and he thought that he'd just been prey to imaginations because this was where the great highwayman John Whitefield lurked. But he didn't know anybody who'd been accosted by Whitefield, and perhaps he half imagined that Whitefield's story was just that, a story to scare children and the weak-minded. But as he went on, he became more aware of the sound of another horse behind him, matching his pace, perhaps waiting for a dark turn in the road where robbery would be easier and less likely to be observed. But there were no other travellers on the road. The evening was dark, the weather was bad, and as it said, only the bravest or the most foolhardy would travel the great high road after dark in those years. He speeded his horse up, now more alert, and as he speeded, and as the horse's pace picked up, he heard the sound of the other's horse quickening after him, and he felt fear rise to his throat. And then they came to a turn just under the shadow of Barrack Fell, where the trees clustered on the sides of that pointed, peaked hill, and visibility was poorer still. No one would see whatever happened here, and this must have been his pursuer's plan, for with a rush he heard the horse galloping. He tried to make his own horse gallop, but the pursuer was faster still and cut him off. And a dark, cloaked figure, wearing a blue coat and a mask and a tricorn hat, came in front of him, pulled out 2 pistols, and said, "Stand and deliver your money or your life." At first Isaac Dodd didn't know what to say, so taken aback was he, and the man continued, "Aye, I'll take whatever you have in your pockets, your guineas and your gold watch and your pocketbook. Now hand it over to me now." And Isaac Dodd said, "And why should I give you my guineas and my gold watch and my pocketbook? What have you done to deserve this? Who are you?" And the man said, "I am one whose reputation you should know. I am one for whose sake you should have avoided this dark and lonely road on this dreary, miserable night. And I am one who shall shoot you dead if you do not comply with my polite and reasonable request." Now Isaac Dodd was no coward, and he said, "I'll give it to you that you're polite enough, but I don't find your request reasonable to take all my hard-earned belongings, things I've worked long and hard for." And the other man said, "Well, I think my offer of an exchange of your life in return for your valuables is very reasonable indeed." And so they continued with this banter until John Whitefield trained his pistols and said, "Enough of this. Give me your goods, or I'll shoot you dead." At this point, Isaac Dodd, who was not unarmed, first produced his rapier, then produced his pistol, and said, "Have at ye scoundrel." And with his knees, he urged his bay horse towards the highwayman. The highwayman fired with both pistols, first one and then the other. The first one missed, but the second one struck Isaac Dodd in his chest. Not knowing how sorely he was wounded and full of rage and temper at being so accosted on the King's highway, Isaac Dodd continued his charge. Now John Whitefield had discharged both his pistols. He had a dagger, but no other weapon. As they closed, John Whitefield stabbed Isaac Dodd with his dagger, right in his stomach. Isaac Dodd let drop his rapier and let drop his pistol, and with nothing else, grabbed at the blue coat of the highwayman, John Whitefield. But Isaac Dodd had received his death blow, and he could fight no longer, and the highwayman pushed him away. But Isaac Dodd grabbed at one of the pretty silver buttons that lined the vain highwayman's blue coat, and he pulled the button off, but he was very badly injured. John Whitefield then, at knife point, robbed Isaac Dodd of his gold watch and his guineas and his pocketbook, and then he said, "I'll not have you die here on the great high road, so go on your way, and may your horse take you home." And with that, John Whitefield left with his ill-gotten gains. The bay horse knew the way back to Armathwaite very well, and it took its stricken master on its back. And then, when they were in sight of Isaac Dodd's house, the servant, who had been watching out for him because Isaac Dodd was late, saw the horse and saw his slumped master's form on the back of the horse. And he came up to the horse and he grabbed the reins and he took them into the house. Isaac Dodd's wife, Hannah, was beside herself. She ordered one of the maids to take the 2 children and take them in the house and lock the door so they couldn't see the fate of their father. Then she went to Isaac Dodd as he was laid out on the kitchen table, blood running from him, and it was obvious that he had met his end. Hannah, with her hand to her mouth, said, "Husband, husband, who has done this to you?" And it was almost for a minute as if Isaac Dodd was going to speak. But instead he took his death rattle and he passed away. And as he passed away, his fist opened and a silver button fell from his hand and clattered on the stone floor of the kitchen. As I said, John Whitefield's crimes were well known, but so far they had nothing to prove against him. But now this button seemed to be the clue that would lead them to him. And the authorities took it and went to John Whitefield's house, and sure enough they found his blue coat with its fancy silver buttons, and one of those buttons missing, and the button that was missing matched exactly the silver button that had fallen from the dead hand of Isaac Dodd. An emergency assizes was held at Carlisle Castle, and a judge was called and soon found John Whitefield guilty of the murder of Isaac Dodd. John Whitefield, to his credit, admitted that he had killed Isaac Dodd, but he said if he'd only let me rob him and not pulled out his pistol and his rapier, he would be alive today. Such foolishness that men trade baubles and gewgaws like guineas and pocketbooks and gold watches for their lives and their family. He could be living to a grand old age with his children around him and his grey-haired wife beside him, and now he lies in the grave just because he wouldn't part with a few scraps of money. But the judge was not persuaded to offer leniency even on this account, and he ordered that John Whitefield be gibbeted alive in an iron cage that was hung by the great high road under the shadow of the tall pointed hill known as Barrack Fell. But the story doesn't end here, because it took John Whitefield 2 weeks to die, and he screamed and he whimpered as every passenger and every traveller went past on the great high road and saw his emaciated naked form imprisoned in the iron gibbet that swung in the wind, and how he screamed louder as the crows and the ravens alighted on the gibbet and took what flesh they could reach through the iron cage. Now, in those days, there was a daily mail coach that went from Carlisle to Penrith on the Great High Road. He went in the morning and came back in the afternoon. The driver tended to be the same man, and twice a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, he had to endure the screamings of John Whitefield as the coach went under the shadow of Barrack Fell. And after 2 weeks, moved by pity, he took the musket he held beside him for defence against highwaymen and shot John Whitefield dead. But it doesn't end there, because since that time, on dark, windy nights, under the shadow of Barrack Fell, where the great high road still goes, although it's less used these days, travellers have reported hearing screaming in the wind from where the gibbet used to hang. And it might be that if you find yourself on the great high road under the shadow of Barrack Fell, you'll hear the squeaking of the chains of the gibbet as it moves in the wind, even though it's been long removed. And you might hear the wailings and the screams of John Whitefield. And if you're very unlucky, you might even see the spectral form of John Whitefield that is reported to haunt the crossroads under the shadow of Barrack Fell, where the road turns for Cotehill. And if you see him, he may well point his ghostly pistols at you and issue you the command, stand and deliver your money or your life. And then you might need to think which is the most important, your money or your life, and not make the mistake that young Isaac Dodd's made on that night in September 1777.
Everybody dies, don't they? Some come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?